to hear from the other presenters. Whoops, I'm sorry about that. I forgot to record. My apologies. Thank you. I just wanted to note that we do not have any discussants today, so we'll be doing sort of slightly extended presentations, around 15 plus minutes. I think as sort of a norm here, let's have questions held till the end unless they're really clarifying questions, something that is unclear, you don't understand. And then we'll have, a solid 15 minutes at the end to take questions from the group as a whole. So without further ado, I will introduce Anna Stansbury, who can take it away.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks everyone. It's really great to be here and really excited to be presenting today. So I'm just going to share my slides. Perfect. So I'm assuming everyone can see that, but do shout if not. So I'm presenting work today on employer concentration in the US labor market, and this is joint work with Gregor, Schubert and Bledi, Taska. As all of you in this room know, there's been an upsurge in interest in, concern about and research about employer concentration in the US labor market in recent years, largely motivated by pretty path-breaking empirical research by other researchers that documented two quite striking empirical facts about the US labor market. These facts is that many US labor markets on the face of it look quite concentrated. That is, they look like that there are few employers available for workers to choose from. So the histograms that you see on the slide plot the HHI, the Herfinell-Hirschman Index, which is a measure of concentration in the labor market. It's the sum of the squared employer shares in a labor market, and it defines a labor market as a local occupation within a metropolitan area. And under antitrust guidelines in product markets, one might think of an HHI of about 1,500 or higher as indicating a concentration that's worthy of further scrutiny. And you can see that a lot of US labor markets and a non-trivial share of US workers from these histograms are in labor markets that meet that level of concentration. And so that could suggest that we have an employer concentration issue that needs to be further investigated. Although, of course, it begs the question of market definition. Is a local occupation the relevant market through which we should be analyzing workers' employment opportunities? And therefore, if not, how should we think about employer concentration, and especially as it's going to relate to policy questions? The second is the fact on the right. On the bin scatter plot, you see that local occupations that have high HHIs, that are highly concentrated, that have few employers, tend to have substantially lower wages. And this is just in the cross section, but this relationship also persists if you control for occupation and metro area fixed effects. And so what this relationship has led researchers and policymakers to be concerned about is that this employer concentration could be generating monopsony power in these labor markets, which is suppressing wages. But the empirical question this raises, of course, is one of endogeneity. It's possible to construct stories where declining local productivity or dynamism reduces the number of employers and reduces wages without it being causal. And the implications of those different explanations for the correlation matter a lot for the policy implications. So our paper seeks to ask the question, what effect does employer concentration have on wages, trying to assess that across as broad a swathe as possible of the US labor market as we can, and for whom does it matter the most? So the primary contribution of our paper is empirical, but before I dig into the empirical specification, just a bit of a headline on the theory. Why should we think employer concentration might matter for wages? Monopsony power is the idea that an employer might have wage setting power in a labor market, and employer concentration can be one source of monopsony power. And one can think of employer concentration suppressing wages in several ways. The way we frame it in our paper is thinking about it as affecting workers' outside option. So a workers' outside option is going to set a baseline floor on the level of the wage, because if the wage falls below the value of the workers' outside option, they leave the firm. We argue that employer concentration features in the value of the workers' outside option because it reduces the effective number of jobs the worker can get if they leave their current employer. and therefore reduces the availability of outside options that that worker can essentially use as bargaining leverage or as implicit leverage, even if they don't have any bargaining say in the wage setting relationship when the firm is setting compensation policy. So we're looking at it with this lens and we're asking, what do we see in the data? So we look at 100,000 local occupational labor markets across the US, defining an occupation as a SOC 6-digit occupation. So quite narrowly, there are 800 SOC 6-digit occupations over 2013 to 2016. Our baseline empirical specification is as follows. We're regressing the log of the average hourly wage in each of these local occupations in a given year on the log of the HHI, the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index of Employer Concentration. And we measure this using vacancy posting data. So we're constructing the HHI as the sum of the squared shares of vacancies that are posted online in a given year in a given local occupation that are accounted for by each employer. And this has been used by some of the early work on this topic, including Azar Marinescu, Steinbaum, and Taska's paper. And then in every specification, we're going to control for occupation by year and metro area by year fixed effects to account for common factors that might be affecting both concentration and wages, but are not necessarily causal in a given occupation or in a given local area. But of course, this specification doesn't yet deal with those two empirical issues I outlined at the start, market definition and endogeneity. So I'll now go through each of those in turn. The market definition issue is really one that any analysis of kind of concentration, whether in labor markets or product markets, has to deal with, which is if you're making a measure of concentration in a market, almost by definition, you're going to have to define a market which is binary. You leave out all the jobs that are outside of the market and implicitly assume they're irrelevant to the worker, and all jobs within the labor market are implicitly assumed to be perfectly substitutable. And we know, of course, that that's not how labor markets work in practice, but the question is, how bad is that assumption for different workers and how much might it matter for our empirical results? So to answer that question, we construct a new data set on occupational mobility. This is a very granular data set with measuring occupational mobility between the pairs of 800 by 800 SOC 6-digit occupations. And we construct this from a data set of 16 million US workers' resumes from Burning Glass Technologies. And basically, because resumes are a sort of longitudinal snapshot of workers' career histories, you can construct their occupational transitions from their resumes and get a good sense of, for the larger occupations in the country, where people go when they leave their occupation. And you can see two visualizations here of counter attendance on the left, of registered nurses on the right. And the big takeaway from this data is essentially that occupational mobility is high. So administrative occupation boundaries do not capture a very large share of the transitions that workers actually make, and therefore the relevant job options that workers actually have. But also that they're differently poor for different occupations. Counter attendants on the left are leaving their occupation more than a third of the time when they leave their job. Nurses on the right are leaving their occupation less than 10% of the time when they leave their job. So when we think about defining a labor market, taking into account differential levels of outward occupational mobility are going to matter for how good an approximation that local occupation is, as well as being able to identify what are the most relevant occupations that people move to. And it's worth just noting quickly here, this occupational mobility data we think is hopefully valuable to other researchers because it's more granular than anything you can get from something like the CPS. So we've made it available, more than happy for people to use it, and please let us know if you do, so we can be helpful. So knowing this, we kind of take an approach to market definition, which is trying to be flexible. We're trying to be able to look across the entirety of the labour market to assess workers' outside options and the effect on their wages, but also be able to stick with that baseline definition of employer concentration within a local occupation, because that's a useful benchmark. It's easily measurable, it uses administrative boundaries, and you can compare it across all occupations. So to do that, we do two things that modify that initial baseline specification I showed you earlier. The first thing we do is we allow the coefficient on the HHI to vary by the quartile of outward occupational mobility. So essentially, we're saying that the registered nurses are allowed to have a different effect of the HHI within their occupation on the wage than those counter attendants, because one would expect that if you find it very hard to find a job option outside your occupation, you have low outward occupational mobility, then there's going to be more of an effect of having few employers within your occupation to choose from. And the second thing we do is we introduce a new measure that we call the Outside Occupation Option Index, OOOX. And this index is trying to measure the value of job options outside workers' occupation for their wage. And it's meant to be a complement to the idea of the HHI measuring the availability of job options within the occupation. This Outside Occupation Option Index we can derive from our theoretical framework, but it's also just quite an intuitive measure. It's just the weighted average of wages in other occupations outside your own one in your local area, weighted by something that we construct to be a proxy for the likelihood that you would be able to get a comparably good job in that occupation if you left your own job in your own occupation. And so to proxy, we use that occupational mobility data I just outlined earlier. National transition shares from my occupation, let's say counter attendant, to each destination occupation, like a sales representative. And then we reweight that for the local availability of jobs in each destination occupation in your local area, just to reflect the fact that different areas have different occupational employment compositions. And so jointly estimating the effect of the OOX index on the wage alongside the within occupation HHI, which will enable us partly to test whether outside occupation options actually do matter, and also partly to ensure that we're not getting any bias in our regression results from failing to consider job options outside workers' occupation. The second empirical issue was endogeneity. And the issue here is just that local productivity, other local economic conditions can affect the number of firms and the concentration of firms that are in a local occupation and can affect the wage. And so if we're looking at a correlation between concentration and wages, we have no way of knowing whether it's causal or how big the causal effect might be. So we try and get around this by developing a shift share or granular IV that essentially identifies plausibly exogenous variation in local employer concentration that comes from trends in large national firms' hiring behavior. So conceptually, changes in employer concentration in your local occupation are largely driven by the changes of a handful of large employers in your area. And so we instrument for each local employer's hiring behavior with the national hiring behavior of that employer. In detail, basically the instrument is as follows. We instrument for each local firm's vacancy growth with the national vacancy growth of those firms. That's the shock in the shift share terminology, plausibly exogenous. And then the exposure to that shock is driven by the share of employment accounted for by that employer in your local area at the beginning of the period. And we introduce controls to control for the fact that this exposure might have differential effects on labour demand as well. We also have an instrument for the outside occupation option index. And the endogeneity problem is similar there. It might be that local economic conditions affect both the outside occupation options and the wage in your own occupation. So we have just a simple Bartik shift share instrument here, where we instrument for wages in each local occupation with the national wage trends in that occupation, excluding your own local area. And that's the shock. And then your exposure to that shock is driven by the employment share of each occupation in your local area. So what do we find? Well, as a reminder, we're looking at the effect of both the within occupation employer concentration index and this outside occupation option index on the wage with these occupation by year and metro area by year fixed effects. And this table is our main results, and I'm going to draw your attention to three features. The first is to note that in our full specification, column D with the IVs, employer concentration does seem to have a causal effect on wages. It's strongly statistically significant and is actually bigger than the effect that we see in the baseline OLS correlation. Outside occupation options also matter for the wage, a joint test of the idea that job options outside workers' occupation are large and important in terms of their wage determination, but also that you can identify them with this network of occupational mobility flows. And you do see bias when you're trying to estimate the effect of employer concentration on wages without controlling for the value of these outside occupation job options. The fourth finding that we think is important to highlight is heterogeneity in this effect of the HHI within an occupation on the wage. And I'm going to show you that on the next slide. So that's going to plot this coefficient, the effect of the HHI on the wage, but in a coefficient plot. So you can see here, the red diamond is the effect I just showed you on the previous page. That's the full sample. And then the bottom panels of this coefficient plot, we're segmenting the effect of employer concentration on the wage by the degree of outward mobility of the occupation. So Q1 is occupations with low outward mobility, like the registered nurse or like security guards who rarely leave their occupation when they leave their job. And we see a very large and significant effect of within occupation employer concentration on the wage for this group. Q4, occupations who very frequently leave their occupation, like the counter attendant, we find no statistically significant effect of employer concentration within your occupation on the wage, presumably because it's relatively easy to find comparably good jobs outside your occupation. And the magnitude of these effects are relatively large. So moving from the median to the 95th percentile of employer concentration, we find is associated with a 3% lower wage on average, 6% lower wage for the lowest outward mobility quartile of occupations, and at most a 1.5% lower wage for the highest outward mobility quartile. Now, in my final minute, the last thing I want to do is just a little back of the envelope exercise to ask, well, who does this matter for? So we've identified this relatively large and causal effect of within occupation employer concentration on the wage. So what we do now is a back of the envelope calculation for each local occupation that has above median employer concentration and say, what is the wage effect, applying our regression coefficient, of bringing that HHI to the median, counterfactually, but not changing anything else. And you can see here that because there are two factors going into it, the HHI of the cell and the outward mobility of the occupation, you can create a 2x2 matrix sort of laying out with different criteria how big the estimated wage effect we would expect to be. And overall, this exercise suggests to us that more than 10% of workers in the US labor market are seeing what we call non-trivial wage effects of at least 2% from employer concentration. And this table shows you which occupations seem to be most at risk. And I've highlighted in here in blue, we could dig into it forever, we won't, but I've highlighted in blue healthcare occupations. Healthcare sort of fits in a perfect storm of having high employer concentration in the industry in local areas, as well as low outward occupational mobility because people have invested in credentials, qualifications, and training that mean that it's difficult to find a comparably good job outside your occupation. So, to sum up, while most workers in the US are not in highly concentrated labor markets, for those who are, employer concentration seems to matter for the wage. Moving from the median to the 95th percentile HHI, on average, we see reduces wages by about 3%, but this effect is very much higher for low outward mobility occupations. We take away from this that the increase in attention from research and policy towards employer concentration is certainly justified, and that it's important that this attention is targeted towards the workers for whom employer concentration is a true problem, and that occupational mobility and outside occupation options should be part of that discussion of how to target and identify initial screens in antitrust, for example, the workers who are most at risk of wage effects from employer concentration. And I'm sure we're going to talk more in the next presentations about policy responses, but the three big buckets that we think are relevant here are antitrust, countervailing power or wage floors for affected workers, and policies that increase workers' mobility, both across occupations or across place, to enable them to have more employers that they can pick from. So let me leave it there and say thank you. The paper's on my website, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that great presentation. By the way, I did see the question in the chat, so I think we'll just kind of save those there and look back at the end of all three presentations. But thank you for that. Keep those coming.
That's good.
But with that said, I will pass it off to Suresh.
Great. Thanks. Let me figure out this slides business. Come on. All right. Give me a minute.
Well, perhaps while you're
You can take a question or two while I.
yeah,
fill in
I was
the
going to say,
end.
I don't know, Anna, if you wanted to
Yeah.
speak to the question that was put in the chat during your talk.
Yeah, I will. Thanks, Maurice. That's a great question. So the question is, to what extent a lack of mobility for security guards and nurses due to occupational regulation? I mean, this is obviously something I know Maurice Klein is an expert on, among many other things, occupational licensing, so you might be able to answer this better than me. But my sense is that a lot of the professions that do have low outward mobility are also professions that have a large degree of occupational licensing qualification requirements. I don't know what the counterfactual is in terms of mobility if those licenses or qualifications were not required, in the sense that part of the lack of outward mobility is going to be you've acquired a bunch of on-the-job training that makes you more valuable as a nurse than as something else. And part of it is going to be that it's difficult to transfer into other things because you have to get a credential on top of it. I'd be really interested in understanding how much is which. Because if it's mostly the on-the-job training and the expertise, or security guards, for example, often are former police, former military, where there just aren't that many other jobs that maybe suit your skills and personality, then the occupational regulation might not be a big part of it, but for others it might be. The one area that I think might be really relevant is reciprocal recognition of state-specific licenses, because that's somewhere where it would increase geographic mobility within occupation, but that's another aspect of the same issue, without, one would expect, having as detrimental consequences. I'm happy to talk more on this, but I don't want to take up. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Sorry, I'm taking. This is my Acrobat crashed, of course.
Oh no.
So if you prefer, I can hop in now. Do my
Oh, go for it. Yeah, go for it. Go for it. That would be great.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so I will take the floor now. Let me get mine sharing. Hopefully I don't have tech issues, which probably will. Let's see. All right, can everyone see that there? Okay, great. Okay, so let me introduce this work, which is called Noncompete Agreements in the Welfare of Consumers. Slightly different title than is in the program, I think. It'll probably change 10 more times before the paper's published, but this is what it is for now. Before I go any further, I will just give the disclaimer that views expressed here are not, do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Trade Commission or any individual commissioners. They are mine and my co-authors alone. And my co-author is Mark Tremblay from Miami University. So he's kind of the IO guy on this paper to some extent, even though I'm at the Federal Trade Commission, I'm more the labor person. The paper is going to really be about the interface of those two things, and hopefully it'll be interesting to everyone here who likely is more interested in the labor side. So what I want to do is I want to tell a little bit of a story just to kind of frame the idea that I have in mind. And it's not terribly complicated, but just to think about something that really happens all the time. So once upon a time, there was Jill, and Jill was an expert at going up and down the hill and getting water. And so she started Pail Fetch LLC, of course, a liquid lugging corporation. And her business was getting too big for her. And so she decided she needed an employee. And so she hired Jack. So he came on as her first employee. And business was good. They were going up the hill of profit. And why was that? Why were they able to make profits? Well, let's just say that, for example, in this case, the reason that is that the industry had some knowledge barriers. So maybe Jill was the only one who really knew the best way to bring water up and down a hill. And no one else could quite figure it out the way that she could. And those knowledge barriers granted her firm market power. And that market power in turn allowed her to accrue monopoly rents. And of course, to some extent, that's one of many holy grails for a company that is trying to, exemplify itself in a competitive market. They want to find a way to differentiate and get some sort of rent, monopoly rent or otherwise. So here we have Jack, and Jack's a bright guy too, and he says to himself, well, there are these monopoly rents floating around. There are knowledge barriers to entry, but I've been working here for quite some time, and I sort of know the territory, and maybe I have some ability here to capture some of those rents that previously had solely belonged to Jill, or maybe had been shared to some extent. And so Jack decides that he wants to form an employee spinoff. So let me take a little bit of a step back or step forward, depending on how you look at it, and think about the literature on employee spinoffs. So in 2011, Folgieri and Civilier had a paper where they noted something that is not that surprising, but they noted that firms created by workers of established firms tend to compete in similar industries as their parent firm. So this is not so surprising. When you spin off and you start a new business, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to be in that same industry as your parent firm. And they asked a question in that paper very, very directly. They asked, why don't established firms prevent creation of such new firms that lead to greater competition? I'm making my money on monopoly rents. Why would I possibly want to let one of my employees spin off? Why wouldn't I do something about that to prevent those employees from competing in similar industries to the firm that I currently own? Well, it turns out that Jill was a savvy business owner, and she anticipated exactly this problem. And when Jack was hired, she had him sign a non-compete agreement. And so his employee spinoff was canceled. He could not do it because his non-compete stipulated that he was not allowed to spin off and form a competing firm to Palefetch LLC. So let me talk a little bit about what goes on here for consumers. And this may not be the typical way that you've thought about non-competes if you've spent any time thinking about non-competes, because thinking about consumers is a little bit of new ground to some extent, at least academically speaking, and for non-competes. On the one hand, non-competes may stifle employee entrepreneurship. So they may do exactly what Jill intended them to do here. They may prevent Jack from spinning off and competing as a spinoff firm. So less chance of competition sort of down the road. Now, on the other hand, the sort of typical explanation for non-compete use is that there's this holdup problem. The employer is not willing to invest in the employee. Jill is not willing to share her trade secrets with Jack or train Jack because she's worried that he's going to do exactly what he thought he would eventually do, walk off and start a new firm. Non-competes solve that problem, and they allow the employer to increase their investment level in the workers. And it's possible that this passes through to value for consumers. If Jack is just a terrible employee because he hasn't been trained, then it's possible that there's going to be a lot of lost value for consumers that could have been gained or could be there if Jack were trained because Jill wasn't afraid of losing him and had a non-compete. Jack had a non-compete. So that's kind of the trade-off I want to be thinking about here. And I just want to point out for those of you who are, who think about antitrust at all, this actually has a really, really nice parallel to antitrust. And this is one of the things we're working on formalizing in the paper. But in antitrust, at least sort of how it's been practiced in the past several decades, the trade-off that policymakers or judges are supposed to be concerned with is, well, there's on the one hand competition in the market, which may drive prices down. More competition means lower prices in theory. And on the other hand, there are what they call cost efficiencies, that if two firms merge together, there may be all these synergies and all this, business school stuff that they talk about that makes it so that costs are actually much lower for the merged firm than they were for at least one of the separate firms. And that could drive value for the consumer by decreasing marginal costs and therefore decreasing price. So I think it's actually a really natural analogy here to think about it in that context. So the contribution of this paper here is I want to just ignore the direct impacts on workers and the direct impacts on firms, in the sense that I don't want to think about this holdup problem in terms of how much it affects the worker, in terms of does a non-compete prevent them from looking for new jobs? Are there wage losses, things like that? I want to really think about the market here. And you may find that to be counterintuitive, but I'll be the first one to tell you, and based on some of my work, that non-competes do have impacts on workers. There are really dramatic impacts on workers. And non-competes obviously have very direct impacts on firms that, we know that more training goes on when workers sign non-competes, for example. But that's not really what I want to think about here. I want to think about the competitive aspect of all of this. I want to ignore like all those behavioral contracting things. Maybe the worker didn't know that they signed a non-compete, for example, or maybe there's frictions when they're trying to renegotiate their contract. I want to ignore all that. And I want to model this consumer impact. What is the trade-off between competition and investment that passes through to the consumer? In a nutshell, my goal here is to convince your most hardcore Chicago economist, free market economist, that non-competes can have negative impacts on markets under certain conditions, even when you ignore all these possible frictions and behavioral things, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the framework I'm going to attack this from. So I want to, before jumping in, it's actually really a theory paper, and I won't give you much theory today. I don't have too much time left here, but I want to present kind of two stylized facts, and these are based on a data set of basically how non-compete enforceability has changed over time. So I'm not going to go into too much detail there. If anyone's interested, I can talk about it later. But basically, the idea here is that as you have a law change, which changes the extent to which non-competes are enforceable, you have really dramatic impacts on HHI. And these are not particularly well-defined HHIs. These are actually employment shares as opposed to like sales shares. So that's one of the things we're working on here, is shoring up the empirics. But what you see is that when the law goes into effect, and this is an increase in the enforceability, so when more non-competes are used because they're more easily enforceable, you see this increase in HHI that accompanies that. So increased concentration industrially. So you might ask, how does that pass through to prices? Well, the impact is a little bit more muted, and our model actually predicts some of this, that there are more trade-offs here because of the cost efficiencies type things, but you also see potentially some increases on prices. So these are price effects in MSAs. So these are just kind of two, I want to think of these as stylized facts. I don't want to argue about causality here, although ultimately I kind of do think that they are causal, but I'll leave that for the paper. And I'll kind of walk into the model. And I want to just, I'm showing you this theory timing here. I'm really not going to talk about the model too much, just to say it's very simple. There's going to be an offer, a wage and a non-compete. The worker can accept or reject. If they accept, they get paid. And then the owner is going to have an investment decision. So that's where the sort of cost efficiency is coming from. Then the worker decides whether or not they're going to spin off. There might be some side payments made, and that's it. That's the whole model. And so we're generating sort of everything based on that very simplistic model. So what do we get out of that? Well, first, as sort of a side note, the non-compete, the function of the non-compete is to assign ownership of investment returns. If the firm invests in the worker, if there's a non-compete, they own the returns to that investment, and they do not otherwise. So they're only going to invest if they own the returns to that, i.e. if they have a non-compete. This frictionless renegotiation that we have built into the model means that it doesn't matter if you have a non-compete or not when investment is expensive. Everyone kind of, there's not a lot of uncertainty here. There's frictionless renegotiation. So you can just sort of renegotiate things afterwards if you're not going to be investing anyway. So we can represent the main results here. When investment is really expensive, you sort of get a duopoly some of the time and a monopoly some of the time. The monopoly is going to occur when the spin-off marginal cost is very high, i.e. when spin-offs are not profitable. When investment is a little bit cheaper, you get more monopoly. And this is exactly the trade-off that I was describing earlier. You get that more monopoly because you're willing to invest, and that's going to drive the marginal cost of the firm to be lower. So if we think about what happens when there's a ban on non-competes, just as sort of a sample policy here, the first thing is that you're not going to get any investment because, again, non-competes assign the ownership of the returns to investment, and so no one's going to invest. The other thing that's going to happen is cell 4 is going to move to a duopoly. So cell 4 here is this one. So what this means is that when investment can't occur here, investment is what's driving our monopoly outcome here. And so this is going to become a duopoly. And that's going to be a good thing for the consumer. That's going to mean increased competition. And that, in theory, can drive down prices. So that's their gain. But the loss is that that decreased investment, which is potentially passing through to price, is going to mean that there could also be higher prices because that investment isn't occurring. Jack doesn't really know how to lug the water up the hill. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail on the theory today. This is really a very early stage paper. So I wanted to spend a slide just talking about what some of our next steps are and how we want to move forward this. One thing I want this paper to do is I want it to provide tools to policymakers to be able to assess when a non-compete is likely going to cause these sort of anti-competitive actions, or when it's going to be likely more benign. So I want to be able to quantify those consumer harms, similar to the tools that we use in antitrust. I want to be able to say, here's the associated consumer harm. So one thing that we may be able to do there is use things like pay for delay. When one company pays another company not to enter a market, it's very similar to a non-compete in spirit. I also want to think about some heterogeneity. Where are industries with likely positive or negative effects? Monopolized industries are likely going to be much more affected because there's a lot more room for an entering firm to have an effect on prices. And so that's one place where you see this, but there are many more places where there's heterogeneity in the model along that dimension. So like I just said. And then finally, I want to use some better data to shore up some of the empirical analysis. So we're in the process of applying for your standard restricted use census data to get these not to be employment-based HHIs at a really coarse level. So hopefully that will help, make those plots really have a lot more power. So that's all I have today. I appreciate any questions and comments, especially directions moving forward. I know I kind of gave more of an outline and a framework today than too many actual results, but I'm really eager to hear if anyone has anything that they would be interested to see in the future. So thank you so much. And with that, assuming you're ready here, Suresh, I will pass it over to you.
Great. Can you all see this? No. Share. Good, you guys can see this? Yes, great. Okay, so when Mike asked me for this, I said I'd give a slightly different paper than this, but it's actually, this is a better version of the same argument. And so I think Mike will forgive me. And it is really the same argument. That's, and you'll see, except this one was made more with empirics as opposed to a calibration. But all right, so some background. Obviously, the resurgence of literature in monopsony. I don't need to tell. I think most of the people here there. Well, some outstanding questions remain. It's like, do we know if monopsony power has changed over time? And I think as a good segue from the last two talks, it's it's a question. Is monopsony mostly what I've called like monopsony by artifice, so like non-competes and anti-poaching agreements, or is it like market concentration, like in Anna's paper? And so it comes back to like questions about like how do we measure market monopsony power and how do we interpret it? What we're seeing. And so I'm going to kind of present a view from like the middle-aged monopsony, so not like the old monopsony, but not like the new monopsony, but like the middle-aged monopsony. And that's kind of like the dynamic monopsony sort of framework, which is really focused on essentially the like separations of the quit elasticity. And if you just kind of look in either the calculations at the end of Carden-Kruger's minimum wage book, or kind of very well developed in Manning 2003, you kind of get like a framework for thinking about the separations elasticity. And one of the things that's kind of great about the separations elasticity is that it's really dovetails nicely with matched worker firm data, where you can kind of see flows of workers between firms, and there's a real like sort of synergy, I think, between what it's like. One of the reasons I think dynamic monopsony is like attractive is it's empirically kind of much easier to operationalize and much easier to distinguish flows from, say, neoclassical models where in the limit, like a hedonic equilibrium kind of view is pretty much silent on flows because everyone's indifferent across all the jobs. And so what we were going to look at is kind of what Manning shows is that with constant elasticities in steady state, you basically get that the summary measure of labor market power, the labor supply elasticity facing the firm, is basically like -2 times the quit elasticity. So if you raise the wage by 10% and you sort of see workers leave at, say 30% workers leave, then, you can kind of multiply that number by 2 to roughly get a ballpark estimate of the labor supply elasticity. And so this like separations elasticity is like a great proximate measure of labor market power. And it's a firm specific one. And so you can think about it like a firm faces a particular separations elasticity. So as an example, so in 2017, both Target and Walmart both had an $11 minimum self-imposed minimum wage. 2020, Target raises its minimum to 15, while Walmart's is still 11. You can think of this thought experiment as like, what does this $15 do to Target's quit rate, like its separations? And so could you compare the separations rate between Walmart and Target? And this is essentially what we're trying to isolate in this paper is like, you have two firms, one starts paying a higher wage. How does its quits respond? And then that's going to trace out the separation elasticity. And that's going to give us a measure of labor market power. And you get markdowns. The problem with the existing estimates of this is that they'll, there's a bunch. Some were done first in Manning's book that's been done in many different data sets where you kind of regress, you have a panel of workers and then you kind of look at the probability of a worker quitting as a function of their wage. And there's kind of not much of an identification strategy there. It's just kind of, you're looking at idiosyncratic wage changes. And so obviously there's like lots of omitted variables going on in the wage changes. You can imagine amenities, you can imagine health shocks, you can imagine life changes, all sorts of things that might drive transitions. In particular, a lot of the estimates that are out there kind of use earnings rather than wages. And this is like a kind of a big issue in the low wage labor market. Like the gap between earnings and like hourly wages is non-trivial. And so a lot of papers that sort of say that they're looking at wage effects are in fact looking at earnings effects because it's harder to get data with hours. And so that's a problem because that's gonna actually attenuate the estimates of monopsony. And so one of these puzzles here is that this sort of style of estimating, you get labor supply elasticities around the order of like 1.5 or 2, which are just really small. I mean, not implausibly small, but smaller than, for example, estimates that come from quasi-experimental papers like Sidney Caldwell and Emily Olson's paper. And so these are like, or even other papers using like quasi-experimental variation. You get like labor supply elasticities around 4 in those papers, and that's like kind of a lot larger than 2. And so it's a question like what's going on. And so our strategy here is to kind of synthesize AKM and this dynamic monopsony approach to get the separations response to the firm component of wages. And so basically, we're not going to use all of this like wage variation that we think isn't very good. We're going to try to isolate the component of the wage that's driven purely by the common component of the firm. And that in some sense is kind of like what models of monopsony imply. It's like you can't perfectly wage discriminate. So you have to pay like a chunk of your workers the same wage. And that wage is, a function of your own productivity. And so you shift all the wages of all the workers in some sort of like uniform way. And so once you start trying to isolate this firm component of wages, you're kind of, I think, closer to the ballpark of what models of monopsony imply as opposed to using like the individual component. So we use 2 approaches to measuring this firm component of wages. One, we just kind of use AKM and decompose wages into worker and firm components. The problem is that, as I'll show you, is that like really the assumption under which AKM works actually means that you can't really use AKM to estimate the labor supply elasticity without sort of like a really kind of terrible assumption that rules out worker sorting. But like that, you basically need to say that like there's nothing sort of happening in the labor market that's generating correlation between workers and firms, it's all got to be that the only thing going on in the labor market is monopsony. So I'll talk through that. And then it also doesn't let you get heterogeneous elasticities by worker type. So the approach that we kind of develop and favor is this matched event study framework that kind of is different from AKM and allows but it's kind of getting the same flavor of AKM. And it allows heterogeneous elasticities and allows for there to be match effects. So our key findings, and I can't see it. Oh, okay, no, I can't see my clock, but cut me off whenever I'm running out of time. So just to get the key findings, we get a separation elasticity of around 2. And so, we get kind of close to the quote unquote right answer. Firm labor supply elasticity of around 4. And it's pro-cyclical. And actually the extent to which it co-varies with the unemployment rate is interesting, and I think worthy of further work. It's lower for low-wage workers. So low-wage workers are facing more monopsony power by this measure. And it's interesting because low-wage workers actually have really high turnover. So the base rate of separations for low-wage workers is high, but it's not super sensitive to the wage. And I think that sort of came clear to us in doing this, is that people will say, oh, there's no firm-specific human capital in low-wage labor markets. And, and that may or may not be true, but it turns out you don't need that to generate monopsony power and sort of dynamic monopsony was never sort of relied on something like that. And so, we think we're getting kind of like a really particularly like good window into the extent of monopsony power in the low wage end of the labor market. And we sort of find it's like mostly unrelated to concentration measures. And so this is, if you will, like competitive monopsony. And it's a moderate amount of monopsony power. It's less than the traditional approach. When you look at the estimates that come from the AKM approach, they're like broadly similar in magnitude, but they fail kind of a number of falsification tests, and I probably won't get to them. But okay, the lever that we have here is this matched worker firm data from Oregon, so we have like the kind of great thing about this data is that we have hourly wages. And it's one of the couple of UI systems that actually gets hourly wages, and so this is good. How much time do I have left?
You have about like 7 minutes. 7 minutes,
great. Okay, so this is just kind of what the panel looks like. It's quarterly, so that's good. I'll skip the theoretical framework. Let's just jump to AKM. So in AKM, you can write a worker's wage as like a combination of like all the firm effects, a worker effect, alpha I, a time effect, and an error term. And the assumption you need for identification of AKM is that the firm that once you condition on your own firm fixed effect, nothing about nothing about the firm that you're at predicts your probability of leaving. So basically, and that sort of tells you is that it's kind of this Markovian assumption in Card, Henning, and Klein that basically you're transitioning between firms and conditional on the worker effect and all the firm fixed effects. It's random. And so that means that if you wanted to sort of estimate the degree of monopsony power by just kind of running a regression of the probability of quitting on the estimated firm fixed effect, the coefficient on the firm, you kind of need this additional assumption where the probability of you winding up at a given firm J, is not just a function of all the firm fixed effects and the worker effect, but it's kind of additively separable in the sense that the relationship of your probability of separating as a function of that firm's firm effect is not affected in any way by the worker effect. So that's like kind of a strong assumption, and it rules out sorting. It means that there's no sort of real way for like workers with higher worker effects to be sort of naturally correlated with firms with higher firm fixed effects. So that's a problem. Let's go with it and just sort of see what we get with that assumption. And what we do is in order to because the AKM estimate of a firm fixed effect is like estimated. We kind of solve this by splitting the sample. And let's just go to that. That's the AKM results. They look like the other AKM papers, I think is the point. Some papers are arguing that like AKM doesn't, it suffers from limited mobility bias, but it turns out it's really that when you have a really long panel, like 18 years, you kind of, mobility bias goes away real fast in long panels. And so that we kind of show that we kind of have an appendix table that sort of shows that in long panels, you don't have to worry about this mobility bias. So this is kind of just like the raw scatter plot of separations relative to the mean on the AKM firm effect. And this is basically showing, you get an elasticity. This is like a separations elasticity, so you'd want to multiply this by 2 to get a quit elasticity. Is about minus 1.4. And that's just kind of a cross-sectional regression of the firm effects on the separations. But it's interesting. It's like firms that pay high wages, unsurprisingly, have people that stay there longer and quit less frequently. And that's it. And to the extent that it's like, oh, you're really isolating the firm component of the wage in this regression is kind of all the work that we're doing. And so, when you put together this with the other components of the dynamic monopsony model, like the share coming out of non-employment, the recruit share elasticity, et cetera, you kind of get an overall labor supply elasticity of about 2.9, so around 3. So let's test AKM, and we kind of show this canonical picture of like looking at symmetry of wage gains and wage losses, which kind of rules out match effects. For example, if people are differentially switching into jobs that are particularly good for them, you'd expect to see like gains kind of much larger than losses, and you don't see that here in this Oregon data. And this kind of is showing that again. It's like the interquartile transitions are all kind of symmetric. So 1 to 4 looks the same as 4 to 1. Okay, here's the problem, which is AKM really relies on this assumption that nothing about the unobserved component of the wage affects the probability of you winding up at any given firm. And that's this kind of like match effects are uncorrelated with where you wind up. And turns out that fails. And I think that generally fails. So it's that people are in fact going to firms where they're going to get a higher match effect. And so that's I think fine for the purpose of AKM as a wage decomposition. It's like these match effects are not a big share of the wage variation, but it's problematic for this approach of using AKM to try to estimate the labor supply elasticity. So we had to develop another, and partly what this table shows is that that's a problem. Is like, look, the labor supply elasticity, like the separations rate is reacting to the worker component of the wage, which wouldn't be true in kind of our assumption. And so that's like falsified here. So our alternative approach is, this is like the punchline, is basically essentially to replace the AKM assignment rule with saying, so the AKM assignment rule is that your probability of you being at a given firm is just determined by the firm fixed effects and a worker fixed effect. It's like, well, let's instead of saying that, let's say that your probability of winding up at a given firm is a function of the firm average wages. And instead of a worker fixed effect, we sort of say it's just a function of the whole history of your past assignments and wages. So it's kind of like, instead of like putting in a worker fixed effect and saying that's capturing all the unobserved heterogeneity about that worker, it's saying let's replace that with all of this history of wages and assignments that you've had. And so then once you condition on that history, you're like, you're getting the same, we're sort of saying that that's doing most of the work in terms of identification as the worker fixed effect. It's like, you can think of like the permanent component of a worker's wage as being reasonably well proxied by their whole history of wages and assignments. And then we look at what happens like when you switch from an initial firm to we'll call an intermediate firm. So the thought experiment here is you have two workers. They're at they have the same history of matches and wages. And then one of them goes to a high wage firm and the other one goes to a low wage firm. How long do they stay at that high wage and low wage firm? And that's giving you kind of another estimate of the labor supply elasticity. And so this kind of illustrates it in a picture, is that you can imagine two workers, they're starting at an origin firm, they have very similar histories. So we're matching on the histories of assignments and wages. One separates to a high wage firm, they stay for a long time, and then they re-separate to this final firm. Another worker separates to a low wage firm, they don't stay very long, and then they bounce out of there to another firm. And so the ratio of this difference in the rate at which you stay to this difference in the wages is basically giving you the estimate of the labor supply elasticity. I'll skip this. This is kind of the punchline, is that if you look at if you think of this as an IV, is like you're instrumenting your own wage change when you move with the change in the firm wage. That's like the first stage. And then the second stage is like your probability of leaving that second firm. It's like a hazard of how quickly do you leave. The implied labor supply elasticity is like 4.2. And so we do some other stuff, like I'll point to this one where we sort of control for the Sorkin firm amenities value as like another determinant of this. And that doesn't really change the labor supply elasticities apart. It matters its own rate for separations, but it doesn't really affect the coefficient on the firm wage. Yeah, I think that's about the only. So this then gets interesting. So this is the heterogeneity across sectors in this separations elasticity. And you'll see it's like, it's around 4. It's highest in sort of relatively high wage industries like professional and business financial services. And it's lowest in like art, accommodation, and food. And so that's like, oh, you're getting low labor supply elasticities in low wage sectors. And similarly here, when you look at the quartiles of the pre-separation wage, in the lowest quartile bin, you're getting the lowest labor supply elasticity. So it's like really suggesting that low wage workers are facing the most monopsony power by this measure. And also notice it's lower during the recession, which I think is interesting. Yeah, this is basically just telling you the more monopsony power there is, the better AKM works, in the sense that like the larger the share of wages are explained by firm fixed effects, the lower the labor supply elasticity is. Okay, so let me end with this, which is just kind of the point I sort of said I'd talk about, which is the over concentration on concentration part of this. And more broadly, it's just like this point of like, okay, we think of, if you think of monopsony as this like exceptional thing where it's like, oh, it's really concentrated markets, it's places where there's non-competes, or like anti-poaching devices, you just kind of miss this baseline latent level of wage setting power that employers have, even in labor markets that are thick, have lots of employers, lots of workers, and that look like they have pretty high turnover. Like food services is like the kind of people like, how does McDonald's have any monopsony power? And I think it's like really the case that, yes, it's a high turnover sector, but it's high turnover because people have a lot of stuff going on in their lives. And so they're bouncing out of jobs at like a high rate that's kind of unrelated to the wage. And so the extent to which that turnover is sensitive to the wage, I think, is like a different question than just the kind of like baseline level of turnover. So you can see here that like, oh, in the Portland metro versus non-metro, you don't see much of a difference in this labor supply elasticity. Again, by like concentration measured in employment terms, you're again not getting too much in the way of, if anything, it's like the labor supply elasticity is highest in the most concentrated markets. Is at the county industry level, and then that's by employment, and then this is by payroll, and you sort of get this sort of similar pattern. So I think that's that's kind of the punchline. So I'll conclude with this, like I think what we kind of are trying to do with this paper is look for a methodology that lets us find the kind of monopsony that we think is like the background level of monopsony that you have with, even when you don't have like particularly concentrated markets or artifices like non-competes or no poaching agreements. And so it's around 3 to 4, which is like a non-trivial degree of monopsony power. It's like a 20% markdown. And it's not very different in concentrated versus non-concentrated segments of the labor market. And yeah, I've said everything else, so I'll leave it at that.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Round of applause for the other presenters here. Virtual round of applause. Thanks so much for coming and sharing. We are kind of over already, so I don't know that we have too much time for questions, although it looks like we're not automatically kicked out of the room or anything like that. But so if anyone wants to stick around, shoot off some questions, then feel free. But otherwise, thanks to everyone for coming, and I hope everyone learned something. I know I, for one, am happy to take emails with any questions, comments, etc. Moving forward. So thank you so much.
Thanks all so much. Thanks, Mike, for organizing.
Yeah, thanks. I have some thoughts on your paper, Michael. I don't know.
Cool. Yeah, I'd love to hear them. I now is, to be honest, not the best time, but okay, can we set time to talk some other time?
Sure, absolutely.
Cool. I'll send you an email. That'd be